Hello and welcome to India's Eye. The US has given India Strategic Trade Authorization status, or STA-1, which is normally given to its NATO-level allies. This will allow India to access high-tech defense and non-defense products from America. This also sets the context for India agreeing to sign the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, or COMCASA. This agreement, likely to be signed by the defense minister of two countries on September 6th, will facilitate the transfer of secure communication equipment from the US to India to allow interoperability between their two militaries. COMCASA is part of three foundational agreements for facilitating a close military relationship with the US. India has already signed the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, or LEMOA, in August 2016 to allow the two militaries to replenish supplies from each other's bases. The third agreement, the BECA, or the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement for Geospatial Cooperation, is yet to be negotiated. To understand the changing nature of Indo-US strategic cooperation, we have with us a very eminent panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Meera Shankar, a distinguished diplomat. She was India's ambassador to Germany and to the United States. We have with us Mr. Bharat Karnad, one of our foremost strategic affairs experts. He is Professor of National Security Studies at Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. His new book, Staggering Forward, Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition, is being released at the end of this month. We have Mr. Sanjeev Kumar Srivastava. He is an independent analyst of Indo-US strategic ties. He was earlier working with the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, IDSA, in New Delhi. I welcome all of you to this discussion. Ambassador Meera Shankar, let me begin with you. Now, this US had granted India the status of major defense partner in the final days of the Obama administration. And we were told that was to facilitate high-end defense technology. And now we have something called STA-1, level similar to that of NATO allies. So what does this elevation of India by the United States mean? What does it mean in real terms, and how is it different from being a major defense partner?
I think, let me walk you backwards. When I went as ambassador to the United States, despite the nuclear agreement, India was in the lowest tier of countries, along with Sudan and Vietnam, with which the US's relationship was then not so good, for purposes of exports of defense equipment and dual use technologies. So that meant that there were extremely cumbersome procedures for India. We needed licensing for a whole range of issues, and there were many technologies to which we could not have access. Then I worked with the US administration, the National Security Advisor. This was discussed. The National Security Advisor, the Commerce Secretary, and so on, and also with US business to get this change, to create the framework to get this change, saying that if we have a strategic partnership, then to treat India at the lowest rung of countries for purposes of access to defense technology is not in the interest of either country. Yeah. We were able to upgrade India's status, first to that of a major, of a strategic partner, not an ally. So we had then access to one rung below that of an ally, above what we had earlier, but one rung below. And then eventually the Obama administration passed the legislation actually to designate India a major defense partner, saying that we would have access on par with their closest allies. But this was not codified, properly as to what does this entail. When they say major defense partner, yeah, what does it mean in actual terms, in terms of their regulations? Now with this STA-1, yeah, it has been codified, okay, that we will be treated on par with their closest, okay, strategic allies. Okay. So that is really what it means. Okay. In the last, say, 6-7 years, we have moved up, okay, in terms of possible access to, okay, technologies.
Okay. Bharat Karnad, does this elevated status mean that we would actually get these technologies, or we just have access to these products? And would this be at the cost of excluding other defense partnerships that India may already have or may want to have in the future?
Well, the problem here is that, and I'm speaking about the downside of such agreements. Sorry. All that the STA1 does is essentially increase the scope of the hardware available to you, not technology, the hardware, the products. All that you're now allowed to talk with the companies that supply it is to talk to them about buying it, buying the systems whole, not technology. Now, the US has always been very protective about its technology for reasons that are not entirely clear, considering that we have gotten very frontline technology from the Russians or other purveyors of technology. So that is an American problem. That's the reason why the 2012 Defense Technology and Trade and Technology Initiative has produced nothing so far. Now, insofar as the STA1 is supposed to correct that, it'll only be to the extent that India will be allowed to buy a certain level of hardware, military hardware and goods, that the Americans have given prior clearance for. So that doesn't mean cutting edge technology. And it certainly doesn't mean that the Indian armed services can now go raid any of the companies selling these technologies and get what they want. They won't, because there's a bar and there's a cap on what India will be able to acquire or buy. And that's the fact of that's the reality that you'll have to contend with. On the Comcasa and so on that you mentioned,
we'll come to
that later.
We'll come to that later. But let me stay with STA1. Sanjeev, what were the Indian doubts earlier about US being a reliable defense partner? And now people say that after STA1, we can see the US as a reliable defense partner. And you have Bharat Karna telling you, it just basically means that their shop fronts are open for you in a limited way. You go and pick up the products that they will allow you to purchase, which they were not allowing you to purchase earlier.
This is not 100% the case that now US can be termed as a completely reliable strategic partner. Reliability has certainly been an issue in India-US strategic partnership, and this is still the case. But with the signing of the STA1, I think that the India-US strategic partnership or defense relationship has really moved forward, because the kind of exemptions they will give with regard to the licenses, which earlier they were issuing to, they were restricting to certain countries, India will be exempted from those licenses. So that will facilitate our defense trade with the United States in a much greater way and a much deeper level than it used to be earlier. Now we will be dealing with the United States at par with the South Koreans, Japanese and Australians. So certainly I believe that with the signing of the STA1, our defense relationship with regard to our export controls regulations, I think it has moved forward, and it will generate a certain level of trust. But I still believe that reliability is a factor, and that's why we have been cautious, and we have not termed our relationship with the United States as a kind of an ally, but we are a partner, and partner which can be, which are at the same level, and we will remain as a partner, will not be an ally of the United States.
Now, Mr. Shankar, maybe this is not a fair question, but who does the STA1 favor more? US exporters in a globally competitive market, because they can sell more of what they want to sell to a larger market such as India, or does it favor India because it actually gives us access to sensitive US technologies which were hitherto denied?
I think it's in the interest of both, because India would be able to buy weapon systems of a higher level than earlier, and it certainly enables the US to do more business in India, which was constrained by their own restrictions in terms of the level of equipment that they were willing to transfer to India. Whether this will also mean transfer of technologies is still an open question, because as Bharat said, the US has been restrictive about transfer of technologies, and most of those technologies are privately held. They are held by private companies who naturally see their intellectual property as part of their commercial advantage and are not going to easily part with it. Now you are working with the US under the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative. You've had some minor, pathfinder projects which were taken up. The more ambitious ideas such as jet engine technology or aircraft carrier technology and so on. These are still under discussion, and we have to see where that goes. I mean, in principle, the US has said under DTTI that they are willing to look beyond a buyer-seller relationship at joint development, joint production and so on. But the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. You know, are we able to actually concretize some substantial projects on which we can work together?
Bharat, I stopped you earlier on COMCASA. Now, let's talk about COMCASA. India, they say it's signing COMCASA, which is apparently critical for establishing interoperability between US and Indian militaries. Now, why does India need interoperability with the US military, and for what purposes? I mean, I can understand humanitarian purposes, but that kind of cooperation you need with almost everybody. It depends on which part of the world the humanitarian crisis is taking place. So, is it just about humanitarian crisis and disaster management, or is it something more than that, and against whom?
Let me first go back to the other thing, the STA-1, if I might, and then I'll just address it. The fact is, the STA-1 will also, given the fact that the Indian military and the armed services are besotted by imported armaments of all kinds, you will have a situation where the Indian monies will be diverted to buying these weapon systems and hardware, and the money will be taken away from indigenous efforts, like the light combat aircraft, the MB main battle tank Arjun, and other things that we have on the anvil. So this is what I fear will happen, that our indigenization effort will be hurt by the STA-1. And I hope that doesn't happen. I hope the Indian government has sense enough, the strategic sense enough, not to go haywire in terms of allowing the military to access whatever they want, as in fact Nirmala Sitharaman did say that the military was free to do. And I hope she'll be curbed, you know, she'll be reined in by the Prime Minister and his cohort. As to the COMCASA, the trouble with COMCASA is what you talk about, the humanitarian missions and so on, are a fig leaf. And what the Americans say by way of mean by interoperability is, for instance, that they're giving you something called the Sea Guardian, the surveillance and armed drone for maritime missions. Now, they say that, well, you need uplinks and so on, uplinks provided by COMCASA. Now, that's a very meager excuse for such a very devastating in the sense this, that the COMCASA will prevent horizontal and vertical penetration of Indian communication systems, the most sensitive ones. By the way, the Americans, it's not that the Americans do not now penetrate, have not now penetrated with their technology our communication systems. It is that they'll have direct entry into something like the Strategic Forces Command, our nuclear command and control. This is what I've been worried about for a long time. This is what I've been, you know, writing. And this is something that the government of India seems to have ignored, and they seem to think that just mere assurances from the United States, in a sense, you know, overcomes the fear. Assurances mean nothing. You know, the Americans will do what they want in their interest, whatever is written on document or not. And this is what I think we need to be a little bit more fearful about. And I don't see how they're going to get around it by writing something into drafting a document that will prevent it, because they'll do what they have to once they get access into our communication systems.
So, talking about Indian fears, this was a real fear earlier. That's why we were not signing COMCASA, because we said that they would get into Indian encrypted military communications. But they also said that the Americans could pass it on to other countries. Now, is that fear still there, or is that also going to be written into the agreement that it will not be passed on to anybody?
I won't say the fear, but I would use the word concern, because obviously we have accepted United States as our strategic partner, and I think there's no need to have fear with the United States, but the concerns are there certainly. And but I would also argue that in this 21st century, India-US strategic partnership or defense relationship is our strategic necessity. You raised a question about what is the use of COMCASA, against whom we are going to use.
Interoperability.
Interoperability, against whom. I would say that it is not going to be used against China, because we should, don't think that we should project China as our strategic threat or somebody.
Didn't say that.
Many people observe like this. But my view is that it is in the strategic interest of our own country, our own two nations, two biggest democracies having shared values, shared interests, opportunities, challenges. So considering the vast opportunities which is available for the both democracies, I think we have to develop our partnership. Okay. And in that regard, I think interoperability and signing of STA will help, and it will generate a level of trust which is required in this century.
One could give counter arguments for some other big countries with whom you should have interoperability for the same reasons, and given our historical relations with them. But I won't go into that. Bharat?
Just a technical point. You don't need interoperability of the kind that the Americans are offering you. Why? Because we have been exercising with the American Navy for almost a decade now. How do they interact when they are out on a war exercise, out in the Bay of Bengal or in the Western Pacific, as has been the latest Malabar? What they do is they rig up a jerry-built solution. They'll put in systems that can talk to between ships and ships to submarines and so on, and they'll it's a temporary arrangement which works fine. So we can always rig up such a system and that is interoperable. That makes the forces interoperable in theater. Now, if you have, it doesn't need the kind of encompassing or overarching kind of a system that you are now contemplating, because that's precisely what then renders your systems vulnerable to outside intervention and penetration. That's what I worry about.
Okay. Ambassador Meera Shankar, now assume that all these worries have been taken care of by the government. Let's assume for a moment they have. And they buy this US data transmission equipment. Now, will this equipment be used only on American weapon systems, American platforms, or would it also be used on other platforms that we already have? Or would you have two different systems? One for the Americans and another one for Indians themselves and for, say, other
I would
defense
imagine
partners?
that they would need to island. I would imagine that they would need to island it so that you have the integrity of your own systems and systems that you might have with other partners preserved. Otherwise, then it's a situation which certainly would be a cause for concern. So if they have found a way to island, if they have found a way to keep the integrity, preserve the integrity of your systems outside this, then I think it is something which we have to see, but we don't know as yet.
And for that negotiations, I believe that next week a team is coming from the US, and we will be having a specific discussion on COMCOSA. Our foreign ministry team and their...
No, but is it on islanding that communication systems?
Having some concerns resolved.
Okay, so one of the concerns, Bharat, has been in the past, and I'm not saying it's a justified concern, was that some people said there will be violation of Indian sovereignty due to visits by US inspectors to Indian bases to see whether COMCOSA equipment is being safeguarded or not. Are you passing on that technology to somebody else? Are those fears not justified any longer?
Well, look, the end user certification process applies to all hardware, with or without COMCOSA, incidentally. The things that we've got so far are also open to the end user certification process. Of course, what we have done is amended that process to mean that you cannot have Americans on station on our bases, etc. The Americans have agreed to it, but they can remotely know what you're doing. That's a thing that we have to keep in mind. The other thing I think is it is creating real problems with Russia. Why? Because once you sign COMCOSA and the Americans get an entry into your communication systems, some of the most advanced Russian systems in your employ, like the Akula-2 class nuclear attack submarines that the Russians have given the Indian Navy, are going to become a problematic thing for the Russians. What that means is the Americans will have access to the Russian weapon system, which is amongst their cutting edge weapons platforms. The Russians are saying, well, how are you going to allow this? Well, it's all very well to say you have to island these things. Now look, in practice, these cannot be islanded. Okay, these cannot be islanded, and this is a fact of life. The Americans have been told this is a problem. I'm not sure how they're going to get over the hump, right? And I'm not sure that the Russians are going to be placated by anything you do, because considering the American capability as it is, at penetration, and the fact that generally we are far more, we expose ourselves to much greater risk where Americans are concerned than we do to other countries, for reasons that we all are aware of. We are west tilted anyway. You have this problem. So what does that mean? You are never going to get the kind of advanced systems that the Russians have provided you. That's again a fact of life. Your Su-30 and so on. And now the Akula class. Will the Americans ever give you an nuclear attack submarine, for God's sake? No. So this is where the problem is. And if you don't have it, what happens to your capability?
So Meera, what really happens to now India's defense ties with Russia, which have been excellent in the past, but you are risking those ties now by signing one agreement after the other with the Americans, and Bharat says that these things cannot be, they'll have to be integrated at some level, and that creates problems.
I think we have to take the concerns of our other defense partners into account, because the reality is that you have 60% of your equipment which comes from Russia.
70.
Or maybe 70%, as Bharat is correcting me, it comes from Russia, and many of your most sophisticated systems, as he mentioned, the BrahMos cruise missile, the Su-30, the nuclear submarine, nuclear attack submarine, all these are really systems which have been built with Russian cooperation. So you cannot, you have to find a way where you work out arrangements which are also acceptable to Russia. I don't know if it's possible. Is it possible to square the circle? I'm not sure, but clearly it would be putting yourself in a disadvantageous position if you are not able to address these concerns.
Sanjeev, in what way do these developments bind India to being Washington's partner to balance China's rise? Because you raised the question of China. And how does it help secure US interests in the Indian Ocean region? Because people are saying that this STA-1, etc., is part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and it was announced as such by Michael Pompeo, I think.
Well, I think that certainly it's part of our Act East policy, and we would like to be a player, a strategic player in the Indo-Pacific region, certainly, and it will fulfill our own ambition of playing a responsible role in the Indo-Pacific region. But with regard to China, I would say that we should not project China as our strategic threat. Certainly China is a challenge, we have to manage that challenge, and in that regard, I believe that our cooperation with the United States with regard to managing the ties with China is very crucial. And whenever it has been, I have been observing that whenever there is a threat from China, and we show that our greater desire to have a greater partnership with the United States, it some way balances the behavior of China. It helps in managing our relationship with China. Okay. And similar concerns are also being shared by the United States. So certainly we have a shared interest of managing our relationship with China, and in that regard, India-US cooperation, India-US understanding, which is very crucial.
Okay. Bharat, do you think that the Americans are accepting the fact that, all right, you have a defense relationship with Russia, and they don't mind that ongoing relationship, because after all, only yesterday the Congress has given a waiver to India under CAATSA, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, for signing a 39,000 crore S-400 Triumph air defense system, missile system deal with Russia. It's been exempted yesterday. So why would they exempt it? Because they realize that they can't be the sole suppliers.
No, the larger expectation on the American part is that they'll be able to crowd out the Russians, and that the US will replace Russia as the main arms supplier to India. Yeah. That's the meta objective they have in mind. They may not be able to achieve it next year, but they expect to achieve it in the next decade and more. Now this is the problem. What the STA-1 also does is, as I said before, it postpones the time when you achieve your own arms self-sufficiency. Until you do that, you're always going to be an arms dependency and a subsidiary kind of partner to any big power. Now, this is also a real problem, because we seem to have what I in my new book called a creeper vine foreign policy. You have to have a pole or a trellis or something to wind ourselves around to rise. That's what we think. Now that's wrong, because if that's your definition of how you're going to become a big power, a consequential power, then you remove the pole, the trellis, and it falls down, right? Yeah, okay. So if you rely on the Americans so much, as we did earlier on the Russians, we seem to want to rely on some big power or the other all the time. Okay. And this is not really good for India.
We've really run out of time, but do you agree with him, yes or no?
I think we need to build our own capabilities and stand on our own feet in the long run. Yeah. I don't think a country as large as India should be dependent on any country, should have good relations, but it should keep options.
Okay, all right. Just that we've really run out of time. I'm sorry. So I'd like to thank all of you. Sanjeev Srivastava, sorry for cutting you short. Mr. Bharat Karnad, Ambassador Meera Shankar, thank you for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week. Until then, goodbye, and thanks for watching India's Eye.